Welcome back to the Metal Exchange. Justin and Chris here with you for another week. I am feeling much better. How are you, my friend?
I am good. I am very good. I'm glad to hear that you're doing better. I thought you sounded fine last week, but I was sorry to hear that you weren't feeling so fine. So I'm glad you're feeling better.
Yeah, I definitely pulled through. It was a very enjoyable week, and we are going to talk about some Australian hard rock in a little bit. But before we get there, anything that you enjoyed this particular week? I have a feeling there might be one or two things that you have been listening to on repeat.
Yeah, well, I mentioned last week that I was looking forward to the Beast in Black and Ad Infinitum albums, and I've listened to both of those many times in the past week, and they are both fantastic. I'm a big fan of both of them. So kudos to both bands for making two really good follow up albums after two very strong. Their previous releases were both very strong. I would imagine that we'll be revisiting both of these albums when we do our year end episode. But a couple of interesting things. I'll let you kind of lead the way on this one because it's a little bit more in your wheelhouse. But Porcupine Tree has a new single.
You stole my thunder. I have been looking. So to set the stage, November 1st, I wake up to a text message from a mutual friend of ours, and I thought it was a joke because he said that Porcupine Tree had released a new single, and I thought they were done. I know Steven Wilson had released a solo album, either it was earlier this year or last year. It wasn't my thing. I couldn't get into it. But when I heard that there was new Porcupine Tree music, I was beyond happy. These guys were like my entire college experience. Like I just fell in love with these guys in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was so good to hear that they were back together and recording, and they came out with a new song called Haradon. It's a 8-minute single, in typical Porcupine Tree fashion, and they announced that their album Closure Continuation is coming out on June 24th of next year. The single is fantastic. I cannot wait to hear this. I know they're not really your cup of tea, or at least I guess you got to kind of be in the right mood to dive into these guys. But I would encourage you to listen to the single if you haven't heard it yet. And I will soon force you to listen to one of their albums because that's what we do here at the Metal Exchange.
Torture each other. Yeah.
Yes,
No, I'm
exactly.
just kidding. Yeah, I did download. I pre-ordered the album and I downloaded the track. I can't remember if I listened to it. So I'm just going to assume that I didn't. But I will. Also, couple of things I wanted to mention. Power Glove released a cover of the Ghostbusters theme song originally done by Ray Parker Jr. For Halloween. I thought it was a really well done cover. And Rhapsody of Fire also dropped another single from their upcoming album, Glory for Salvation. Songs called Chains of Destiny. Probably the best of the singles they've put out so far. So definitely worth checking out. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing that album in its entirety. It will be out before the end of the year. So I'm sure it'll be mentioned again before the year is out. But yeah, that was pretty much it for me. How about you outside of Porcupine Tree?
Yeah, so the Porcupine Tree was definitely the highlight of my week. I have to say, I was not expecting that, as I mentioned. But there was one other album that I sent to you offline, and I sent to a mutual friend of ours as well, and he really took a liking to it, which I'm not surprised given his musical scoring background. But the new Diablo Swing Orchestra album, Swagger and a Stroll Down the Rabbit Hole, really good. And I kind of have like an interesting relationship with these guys insofar as it's like I listen to it, I appreciate it, but I never really loved any of their stuff, although I certainly liked some of it. I thought the new album was really good though, and I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. So I don't even know how to describe this band to someone that has never listened to them. Avant-garde, I guess, would be one way to describe it, but it's part big band, part metal, part prog, and just 90% weird, but it's really, really catchy, the new one. So I would be remiss if I did not mention that, and I'll definitely post track or two from it later in the week, just because if it's something that you haven't heard, you definitely should listen to it at least once.
Yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit, actually. I remember seeing them live at Prague Power 10 and really not knowing anything by them and just being very blown away by the performance, just because, there's just nothing like it. It's really just this unbelievable mix of genres. There's metal and there's swing and there's jazz, and like it's just it's pretty wild stuff. So yeah, definitely check it out if you're into a lot of different types of genres, kind of being
Go in
mashed
with an
up
open
together.
mind. Go in
Yeah,
with an
for
open
sure.
mind, and when you do, I think you might be pleasantly surprised. And the band continues to kind of swing on, no pun intended. They've been kind of churning out albums every couple of years. I think this is their fourth or fifth full length release, so kudos to them on that. But let's get to the reason why we are here today, which is AC/DC's Back in Black, going back to July 25th of 1980. The album is 41 years old, and apparently I did not know this. It is the second best selling album in music history, which that alone should tell you the depth of what we're about to cover. But as I had mentioned last week, I had another album picked out, but it was the middle of the World Series. I had been watching every single game, every pitch. And for whatever reason, in Atlanta, when there was like a tense moment, they would start by playing the beginning of Hell's Bells before the pitcher would throw the next pitch. And I'll tell you a little story before we kind of get into the album. I was, again, watching the World Series, but this time I was watching Game 6 in Houston. And they cut to a commercial break early on in the game, in between innings. And all of a sudden, they show a picture of Ozzie Albies, the Braves' young, all-star second baseman who is going to lead off the next inning. And they are playing Back in Black as the music outro to the, as they go into commercial. And I went from being a very, very nervous, concerned fan to realizing that they were about to win the World Series, even though it had been 0-0 in this particular game. Sure enough, Ozzie Albies comes to the plate. He hits a base hit. And a couple of batters later, they hit a 3-run home run that I believe is still on its way up because it was a moonshot. And the Braves won the World Series. So putting my mind at ease, I'd like to thank AC/DC and myself for choosing this album, because I don't think it could have been any more timely for me, because I had one hell of a week, I have to say. But that story aside,
It sounds like this album and the Braves winning the World Series this year will probably be kind of locked together in your memory until.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the timing couldn't have been any more fortuitous. I'll say it that way. Certainly a band that deserves coverage. I pivoted, and then they won the World Series, and it's something that I'll take with me for the next however long I've got here on this planet. But it was amazing, and it was just something that it was like kind of ingrained in me at this point. AC/DC is kind of a band that, I know all the hits. I've heard a lot of the big numbers, but I never did a deep dive into any of their albums or any of their like deeper cuts here. Is it fair to say the same for you?
Yes, definitely. I think I had maybe 5 or 6 of their songs. The real, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, TNT, Highway to Hell, Thunderstruck, kind of the obvious ones. I think I really should probably invest in an AC/DC Greatest Hits album or something and just kind of expand the horizon. But I think listening to Back in Black was a good way to kind of get a couple more songs in the wheelhouse, and get myself more familiar. I knew Hell's Bells, Back in Black, and You Shook Me All Night Long very well going into this. I had never heard any of the other songs, actually. So, that it was cool to kind of hear some other songs, and nothing was really surprising. It sounded like what I would have expected from AC/DC, but
Sure.
It's worth mentioning, like you said, like the popularity of this band. I mean, they're one of the most well-liked rock bands ever, and just this past week, it was announced that their their Thunderstruck music video from their 1990 Razor's Edge album had surpassed 1 billion views on YouTube, which is
That's
insane.
crazy. And I'll tell you a little bit of a funny story with that song. I have season tickets to see the St. John's basketball team play. I've had tickets for probably close to 20 years at this point, going back to when I was a student at the school and then going there again for law school. But the reason I bring that up is because before tip-off, as the team is kind of like, after the national anthem, as they're about ready to like throw the ball up to start the game, they kick it off with Thunderstruck. And my dad, who I go to the games with, said to me, I remember one of these times that they're playing Thunderstruck, he says to me, "What is this?" And it's obviously a very iconic intro to a track. And I said to him, it's a classic AC/DC song. And he just said to me, "This is great." And my dad, God bless, he's in his 70s. He is one of those people that has gone on YouTube and listened to that song repeatedly because he loves it. And he's actually checked out a lot of this stuff. And I guess that's kind of the magic of this band, that they are obviously a hard rock band. Some might call them heavy metal. I think they're strictly a hard rock band in my eyes, but they seem to transcend generations, I guess, where you have people in their 70s that are rocking out, and obviously they're selling out stadiums whenever they play live. And then you have kids that hear this stuff and it still kind of, they latch on to some of these hits as well. It's kind of remarkable in that regard because they have, you mentioned about a half dozen of them. They have certain songs that are just iconic rock and roll songs and probably go down as some of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time.
Did you know that AC/DC is Vince McMahon's favorite band?
I did not know that. Are you serious?
Yeah. I've heard stories of like him going to like AC/DC concerts with like Triple H and Chris Jericho, and like I don't know why. I mean, it probably makes sense when you think of over the years how often AC/DC was used by WWE for pay-per-views and things of that nature. But I think Chris Jericho revealed it in one of his books that AC/DC is Vince McMahon's favorite band, and that's a man who's 76 years old, I believe. So there you go.
It's remarkable. It really is. And I mean, obviously I gave the reasons earlier for why I chose this album, but part of the reason I chose it was I knew the 3 songs you mentioned. It turns out that I knew one or heard one or two others as well, but at least half of this album was, a first impression for me. I did not know let me say this. I kind of knew what to expect, but at the same time I didn't know what to expect. And it was definitely new for me. So I am really, I was happy to kind of go back into the archives because I'll be honest, this is their, I believe, 7th studio album. They've obviously released a number of them since then. I'm probably not going to go back and listen to all of them because I think that my biggest knock on the band is a little repetitive, right? Like some of this stuff is derivative of each other, but when you listen to AC/DC, I think that that's what you want, right? You know that sound, you want that loud arena or stadium rock sound, and they produce that sound over and over and over again, and they kind of hit you over the head with it. But I'll say this, before we get into the album itself, they're a band that I feel like I should have seen live, like at this point, because they're just just an iconic band, and it's just a shame that I don't think they're going to be doing anymore, to say the least.
Yeah, same with me. I know I've never seen them live. I don't even know that I've ever even considered seeing them live. I got a question for you. Did you realize that Bon Scott and Brian Johnson were 2 different people? Because I never really noticed. It wasn't like Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth to me. Like, I always thought that they were similar enough that I never realized that they were different singers, in all honesty.
So I knew this, but I don't think I would have noticed had I not known that, if that makes sense. I always knew that Back in Black was and I use this term a lot, but a turning point for the band, insofar as it was Brian Johnson's first foray as lead vocalist, and this was right after the passing of previous vocalist Bon Scott, who is adored by the fans. But I don't know that I can think of any band that replaced their singer with someone that was almost a spitting image of the original singer, just in terms of, listen, it is a unique vocal style, right? Like this is, and part of the reason I guess I'm shocked that a Vince McMahon or my dad would be into this is the vocals are not exactly accessible, right? This is not Queen, right? This is not Freddie Mercury fronting the band. This is kind of an abrasive, loud, almost obnoxious type of vocals that are employed here, but yet people are drawn to it. And it was both of these guys that were doing it. You were hearing it on Thunderstruck. You were hearing it on this album. You were hearing it on Dirty Deeds 4 years prior. It's amazing what they were able to do without missing a beat. And whenever you employ a new singer, I think that real fans of the band are going to heavily scrutinize the new sound. I certainly did it when I was listening to the different eras of Halloween, and we've done it with other bands, with Angra. I remember when Andre Matos left Angra and Edu had taken over, and it was just different. Great music, just different vocal presentation. But here, from the minute this album kicks off, you can see it's going to kick ass, which is amazing. And as soon as Brian Johnson starts singing, you realize it's like just taking it to the next level. It's remarkable how they actually just were able to continue on without missing a beat here.
Yeah, well said. I agree with you 100% on that. I just like went back and listened to a couple of the older tracks with Bon Scott on them, and when you're listening with a keen ear, yeah, I mean, they're clearly different singers, but
Sure.
Over the years, like just listening to it on the radio, it just never really dawned on me that like, hey, that there's, I thought maybe it was just, okay, this guy sounds a little bit different because it's older, like the older stuff, singers sound different. Like compare, Kai Hansen on Walls of Jericho to Kai Hansen on, Somewhere Out in Space. You might think that was two different singers. So just an interesting personal anecdote that I just never really knew that. And again, like AC/DC wasn't always a band that I knew a ton about anyway. But so yeah, I thought this was an interesting choice for an album just because it was their first album without Bon Scott. And like you said, they kind of just kept on going as if nothing had ever happened.
Yeah, I mean, the passing of Bon Scott was sad. It was due to alcohol poisoning. I won't really go too much into the details there, but it was a tragic passing. And then here they go. And I'll give them credit because this album starts with maybe the most iconic intro track of all time, arguably. And I'm not just talking about like in our little bubble of hard rock and heavy metal. I'm talking like iconic first track on an album. I think you have to put Hell's Bells up there with just about every single album out there in terms of iconic intro. It starts with those bells, then the guitar kicks in, obviously the drums kick in after that, and it's just the slow build to what can only be described as one of the best hard rock songs of all time.
Yeah, I think only For Whom the Bell Tolls comes close as far as songs that start with bells ringing.
There you go, right. But that doesn't kick off Ride the Lightning, right? But here you're kicking off the album with just that iconic bell sound. I think it is like literally the quintessential hard rock song. And what I find interesting is not only were the Braves playing it, obviously at Truist Park, but I used to go to Giants games when I was a kid, and they would right before kickoff play the intro to Hell's Bells before kickoff. So this is being employed.
I thought you were talking about the San Francisco Giants. I was like, wow,
we're just working our way all around the majors. No, but
it's quite a commute to see a ball game. But
yeah, right. The New York Football Giants kicked off their games with it, and it's just like. It's one of those songs that every time I hear it, I kind of start moving and I get antsy and I say to myself, like, you're getting pumped up, and I could see as like the non-professional athlete in me that goes back to high school sports, like wanting to run through a wall when I hear this song. I just think it's I just think it's a fantastic tune with one of the greatest guitar solos for a hard rock band that I've ever heard. It's I'll say this, it is not my song of the week because it was just too easy a choice, but to me it's the best song on the album, hands down. The best AC/DC song I've ever heard.
Wow. Well, there you go. I thought it was an interesting choice to start the album with a song like this because it's a very kind of mid-paced tune, but I think it was the right call just because it's like I don't know, just the way that it ended up becoming. I think of AC/DC as such a like a sporting event friendly band. There's so many songs that you could just picture hearing in between, puck drops at hockey games or at a basketball game or a football game. Like there's just they. If you remember that album Jock Rock, I mean half of those songs could have been AC/DC songs, honestly. So
Yeah, that's really funny you mentioned that, and you're absolutely right. They've carved out a bit of a niche for themselves, because I don't know that I can say that about most bands, but they certainly fit the bill. Any other thoughts on Hell's Bells before we move to Shoot to Thrill?
no, I think this song pretty much speaks for itself. Like you said, it's iconic as hell, no pun intended, and just I think that those bells at the beginning of the song what really puts it over the edge. It really makes it all the more memorable because there's just that audio kind of trigger right at the beginning. So yeah, a great way to start the album, and I like that they jump into a song that's like faster and more like more adrenaline kind of with Shoot to Thrill, which I'm actually going to say this is going to be my song of the week. Just it's not my favorite song on the album either, but it's the song that I didn't know going into it that I ended up really liking. So I wanted to, instead of just picking an obvious choice, go with something that kind of took me by surprise. And this one I ended up really liking. So I'm going to make this one my song of the week.
I am going to make it my song of the week as well. I loved this tune. And I thought it was such a nice contrast, because the beginning of Hell's Bells really is a tribute to Bon Scott. And that's why they play those bells in the beginning. And I guess that's also why it makes sense for an opening track, just in terms of, kind of the new era of the band. Shoot to Thrill begins almost like Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy at the start, which is one of my favorite Zeppelin songs. But the vocals on this track are just absolutely outstanding, but it keeps that groove throughout. I think it's the most underrated track on the album, and I just absolutely adore this song. What I thought was also a nice touch is about 2/3 of the way through the song, it kind of slows down and mellows out a little bit, and then kicks off with another guitar solo, and then they kind of ride the rest of the track out live. That kind of effect, if you will, would be amazing to see live, and it's probably the song that I would want to see the most from this album, just because it's a little bit faster, it's a little bit heavier, and it's really catchy, like really, really catchy. I love this track, so you and I are in complete agreement. Is it my favorite song? Probably not, but I loved it, and it was just a nice surprise for me.
Yeah, that part that you just described kind of reminded me of like Panama by Van Halen, where it kind of, towards the end it gets like kind of a little quiet, a little slow, and then it's like, and then back to business to close out the track. But yeah, this was the one that I just kept that stuck in my head after listening to the album. Really not sure how I had not heard this song before. I don't know if they made a single out of it. I'm not sure which other of the three I mentioned before were singles. I just don't remember hearing any of the other songs on the radio. So
yeah, it wasn't.
I was wondering if you would pick this track too. So I'm kind of glad that we both kind of agree on that. So
yeah,
the suspense is out of the way early.
Yeah, this one was really a no-brainer for me. We'll get to some of these tracks later, but Hell's Bells, which we mentioned, was actually the second single released on the album. Somewhat not surprisingly, You Shook Me All Night Long was the first single released. They'd ultimately released Back in Black and Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution as well as the fourth single. So 40% of the album was released as singles, and maybe the track that kind of hit us the most as a surprise was never released as a single, which I thought is kind of interesting. I wonder if it's a tune that they play live or anything like that. I did not look at set lists, I'll admit, but it was something that I would want to hear if I was going to a show. And I guess,
oddly enough, I just looked it up, and it looks like that it was released as a live single in 2011.
How ironic is that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess they had released a live album around that time, so they released a single from it.
31 years after the fact.
Yeah, and it was in the Iron Man 2 soundtrack. So maybe that's why it was maybe it was a little bit familiar, and I just didn't realize it. But I'll definitely notice it the next time I watch Iron Man 2. I'll say that.
Well, I think that begs the question, and that's what did you do for Money, Honey, which is the third track. It's funny.
I'm an underwriter.
It's funny they kick off this album with two just like perfect songs in my opinion, just two fantastic tunes. And then and you got to remember this is the days of the record, right? So there's 5 songs on each side of the record. They would ultimately kick off side 2 of the record very strong as well. But we get into this third track, and I say to myself, you can't, I guess, go to the well too many times. It's just a bit ordinary, I guess, when you compare it to the last two. Not terrible, but just not as catchy. A little bit nondescript, in my opinion, with extremely cheesy lyrics.
Yes, but also like vintage ACDC.
No question.
And like it's kind of like the ACDC go-to, like, not not popular single track. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my favorite. I thought it was. I mean, you're gonna find a lot of these songs are kind of cheesy lyric wise. Like they're either like really badass, like Hell's Bells or Shoot to Thrill, and then you have like a song like this or the following song, Giving the Dog a Bone.
I cannot stop thinking about. There's a certain imagery that comes to mind when it's Giving the Dog a Bone, and it's something we did talk about briefly earlier this week. Do you want to tell everyone about the video that you almost sent to me as they repeat this chorus over and over again, which is just the name of the title track, Giving the Dog a Bone. I'm not a fan of this song, but I am a fan of the imagery in the video that you almost sent me.
Well, yeah, I was going to just send you a video of my dogs while this song was playing in the background, but I didn't think it'd be that interesting because they were both sleeping through the song. So maybe that says
the sexual innuendo here as well, and we talked a little bit about that last week. The AC/DC is notorious for this. They've been doing this on every album, and certain songs there's no innuendo. When we get to You Shook Me All Night Long, there's no innuendo there. You know exactly what it is. Here, it's a little more nondescript, if you will. I'm not a fan of Giving the Dog a Bone. It's catchy as hell. I certainly find myself humming it and kind of singing it. I acknowledge that. I'm just not a fan of the song. It really is doesn't really do it for me.
Yeah, I kind of put it in the same category as the previous track. Like, it's just okay. Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. It's some of the like overt imagery is maybe it was like edgy in 1980, but now it's just comes off as kind of cheesy. Like I feel like some of the stuff would make Tesla blush after what we spoke about last week. But yeah, not a terrible song, just okay. But then let's go to the next track. If you were talking about subtle imagery, Let Me Put My Love Into You. Yes.
Yeah. Well, My Love is it's funny. I actually do like this track a little bit better, not because of the imagery per se, but because I think the intro is really cool, and this kind of has this like slow guitar riff that kind of permeates a lot of the song, and it reminds me of like either early UFO or early Aerosmith. It's hard for me to put a finger on it, but there's something about this track which I actually really enjoy. Again, another absurd chorus. I did like the backing vocals here. They kind of used this like trick of like dual layered backing vocals, which I thought was kind of cool. Obviously, it's structured like just about every other song on the album. But here's an example of them kind of sticking to the formula and it working for me. So of the first 5 tracks, I would put this one right in the middle in terms of the pantheon of side 1 or the A side of the album. A good tune, not my favorite, but a little bit better than the prior 2 tracks.
Yeah, maybe the worst sexual innuendo ever of "Let me cut your cake with my knife."
Didn't say I'd be singing this, or singing this anytime soon, but it there's something there. There's something on this track which at least musically did it for me, even if it's a little bit absurd.
Yeah, I liked it better than the previous 2 tracks for sure. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned earlier, like about the having 2 sides on an LP, and it's funny because I know we talk a lot about track ordering, and we did it kind of at length when we talked about Fate's Warning's Parallels album. But I mean, it makes sense when you think about like why is Back in Black track 6? Well, you're kind of looking at like this is the first song on side B of either the cassette or the vinyl version. So it's almost like you're kind of starting fresh with another iconic track, kind of like Hell's Bells started side one, Back in Black starts side two. So like it's interesting how that was probably a much larger consideration when vinyl was prominent. Although now vinyl's making quite a comeback. I thought I read somewhere that it's actually more purchased now than CDs.
Really?
Yeah, like it's actually outsold CDs because I think it's just some people swear by it. They say that it sounds better. I don't know that if I necessarily agree with it, but there's certain albums I think are just totally worth having on vinyl, and I feel like having this would be a pretty cool vinyl to have. But I digress. This is another one of the most classic ACD songs. I think of Eric Bischoff coming out to this back in the WCW days. With him coming out to Back in Black and Vince Russo coming out to Iron Man by Black Sabbath.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I would argue maybe the second most famous track on the album before the next one. That you're talking about another iconic intro here with arguably one of the most notable riffs of all time. And to their credit, I've heard it 1,000 times at this point, and it really, even listening to it a half dozen times this week, it held up, right? Great tune, no question about it. I'll say this, and I don't know if you kind of got this, but there's two things going on this track that were a little fascinating to me. Number one, the vocals during the choruses, almost a precursor to rap, right? Is it me, or is Brian Johnson kind of rapping here over those, in those choruses? I thought that was interesting because, rap really wasn't a thing in 1980. And although it's a bit repetitive, there were parts here that almost touch on death metal with the way he uses his vocals as well. So you got a touch of rap and a touch of death metal in a 1980 hard rock song. It was fascinating. And I don't think I ever really listened to it with a critical ear because, I just heard it 1,000 times. But when I really sat down and listened, it's kind of a deeper track than I had ever given it credit for.
Yeah, and that probably has something to do with why it was so popular, just because it probably resonated with more people than maybe some of the other songs from the album that were a little bit just kind of, I don't want to use the word generic, but just kind of like, your typical kind of hard rock kind of song. And this had definitely, like you said, has more layers to it. So I think that makes it maybe accessible to a larger audience. But I mean, even to this day, 41 years later, this is one of the most, not just iconic AC/DC songs, but one of the most iconic rock songs ever.
And I'll say this before we move on. This was the first track, and again, we're more than halfway through the album, but this is the first track where I really noticed how good of a drummer Phil Rudd is. We haven't mentioned him. Obviously, when you think of AC/DC, you think of the vocalists, or you think of Angus and Malcolm Young running around on stage with their guitars. Cliff Williams rounds it out with his bass playing, but Phil Rudd here does some really cool drum fills during the instrumental part of this song, which I thought is just worth noting because I'm not sure I would have mentioned him but for this track and some of the little nuances that stood out to me. But well done, I have to say, very, very well done. And then this track obviously leads into "You Shook Me All Night Long," which I think if you asked most people, that this would be the number one AC/DC song that they either know of or recognize. Probably their most well-known tune.
Yeah, it always makes me think of the Howard Stern biopic, Private Parts, because at the end of the film, I believe it's like 1985, and he's at an AC/DC concert when his wife goes into labor, and I'm sure there was some artistic, artistic freedoms used in that storytelling. But I always think of that at the end of that film with this song playing, and this was a staple on my my party mixes when I was in college. I would. This is going to date myself quite a bit, but this was just shy of the iPod era, and so we had I would burn like 5 discs of of just random party songs, and then we put them in a 5-disc changer and shuffle them. So you'd have these very awkward, like 15-second silences in between tracks. But this was always, I just felt it was just such a fun song to listen to after you've had a few drinks and you're playing some beer pong and everybody's just hanging out. Like, and it reminds me of how I remember I had a housemate who would say, the reason that girls never come to your house for parties is because you don't play any music that they can dance to. And I was like, yeah, well, I don't care, because I'd rather listen to You Shook Me All Night Long, or oh my God, the other one we used to play all the time, if you could believe it, was from Iron Maiden's Brave New World, The Wicker Man.
Wow.
So
I don't even think it was AC/DC that was keeping the girls away. I'm pretty sure it was The Wicker Man, which great song.
It was probably all of the songs that were on that list. I mean, it was like, if you were a rock fan, like, it was Aerosmith and Van Halen and AC/DC and Guns N' Roses, and like, but if you were like coming to a party to dance, like, you were in the wrong house, because it was a rock house.
To the credit of AC/DC, and I'll borrow a phrase that you have not yet used this week, but you've used in past weeks. This is the toe tapper. This is the radio hit. This is the toe tapper. And if girls are going to get on your pool table, this is the song, right? Like, this is the one they're going to actually move to. Have a feeling they never got on your pool table, but that's okay. I do think that this is like, there's a reason they led with this as the first single. It is a really catchy tune. And even though you could argue that it's like played out and you've heard it a million times, I still enjoyed it this week. I have to say, I think it's still a really, really great tune.
Yeah, it's probably my favorite song from this album. I just decided not to choose it as a song of the week, just because, if you don't know this song and you've been living under a rock, I have to.
You're probably not listening to this podcast if you don't know.
Yeah, well, that's a fair point. But even still, like, it's a song where if I see it while I'm flipping through a jukebox at a bar, like, I just think it's a great, like, just partying song, I think.
Totally.
And, it might be my favorite AC/DC song of all time. I do love Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or shout out to Mike Crea, Dirty Deeds Thunder Chief. Story for another album, I suppose. But this is definitely one of my favorites, and it deserves its iconic status.
What did you think of Have a Drink on Me, which is the 8th track?
Like, again, it's just another one of these kind of like mid-paced AC/DC songs that, it's just kind of like, it's pretty straightforward what they're singing about. And it's okay. Like, it's, in all honesty, like, all the songs that I didn't know outside of Shoot to Thrill are all just kind of average to me, and this is another one of those tracks.
I'll just say one thing about this, and it's actually one of my favorite riffs on the entire album. I thought the choruses are kind of weak. I did like the verses here. And again, another good touch with the backing vocals, but the riff itself that permeates this song is a really good riff and very underrated, as opposed to kind of the next two tracks, which Shake a Leg, which is the 9th track, is definitely the track that kind of grew on me more than any other. It actually reminds me a little bit of that early Rush, like a Working Man or Passage to Bangkok vibe, which is kind of cool. And kind of a track that's the solo itself where it's a bit ahead of its time. It grew on me more than any other track, but I can't say that I loved the way this album ends. Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, actually, I thought was maybe the weakest track on the album, and we'll get to that in a second. But Shake a Leg, any thoughts?
Yes. I think it's so interesting that you mentioned early Rush, because this reminded me of Led Zeppelin, and I always thought early Rush reminded me of Led Zeppelin.
There you go.
So, skipping B to get from A to C, I guess. But this was probably my favorite of the other 4 songs, I guess, that I mentioned earlier. I think it's pretty catchy. I think it might have been better served as the final song, because I agree with you. I thought Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution was my least favorite on the album as well. It's just a little bit like kind of dull, I guess.
I am so happy you mentioned that. I would have flipped the two tracks too, and I have that in my notes. Shake a Leg would have made for a great closing track, and I would have buried Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution as the ninth track. I think it's weak.
I would have put Shook Me All Night Long as the last track, because you have side B starting with Back in Black. I think you should have the album end with Shook Me All Night Long. But I mean, who knows, when they were making this album, maybe they had zero clue which songs were going to end up being the singles, or never mind the singles, but like some of the most iconic rock songs of all time.
Fair.
Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution was not one of those songs.
It's sonically, it sounds good. Like, I want to like this track, but I found myself like waiting for this payoff that just never came, and it was repetitive, and it just never clicked, and it made me just want to go back to the start of the album and listen to Hell's Bells again, and just not like listen to that song to end the album. I just that was a miss for me. Can't love them all, but you know, at the end of the day, without patting myself on the back, I was happy that I chose this, because I don't know that I would have ever gone back to listen to any of this stuff.
Yeah, nor would I have. And a funny story is that I wasn't actually looking at my iTunes while I was listening to this album the first time. So when this song ended, I was waiting for the next song to come on, and then Thunderstruck came on. I was like, oh, I guess that's the end. I guess that's how it ended.
That's
I'm
funny.
like, another thing I want to just mention quickly about Thunderstruck, because I don't know how soon it'll be that we speak about AC/DC again. I was shocked when I found out that song came out in 1990. I always assumed it was older for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's such a, I guess, iconic track insofar as it's like just, you know, up there in the top AC/DC songs. But yeah, that came out in 1990. So for longtime fans of the band that go back to the Bon Scott era, to release a track 10 years after Back in Black is released, let alone the Dirty Deeds and all the other the old Bon Scott stuff, they released like a real heavy hitter, kind of, you know, 2 decades into their run as a band. I thought that was really good. It was, you know, you mentioned the Wicker Man earlier, which was kind of the Iron Maiden's return to form with Bruce Dickinson after he rejoined the fold. Even that track, as good as it is, you wouldn't say it's like the most iconic Iron Maiden track, even though it's a phenomenal tune on what I would consider one of their best albums. Story for another day, story for another podcast. But with Thunderstruck, they literally struck gold, again, no pun intended, with that song 20 years into their career.
Yeah, I didn't even think they had any well-known songs like after the 80s, so I was just kind of surprised. So yeah, another, like, that opening riff is another one of the most iconic opening riffs to any song. So and another like sports arena staple, like you mentioned.
For sure. And I guess I'll just kind of put a bow on it by saying, again, I had mentioned earlier, the second most well-sold albums of all time. You're talking about an album that I think went 25 times platinum in the United States. 25 times platinum. I didn't even know that was a thing. I always think about Metallica's Black Album, which I think is still on the Billboard charts, and this just blew it out of the water, right? Like this was on the charts before it and continues to just sell albums. It's incredible in this day and age, but the staying power of this album was truly legendary and second to almost none. Scale of 1 to 10, what are you going to rate this album? Because I have some thoughts here.
Yeah, it's hard for me to say. I'd probably give it a 7. I think that the songs that are great carry it, but the songs that are just okay kind of drag it down for being like an all-time classic for me. So yeah, I think it's just a 7. That solid, but it's not an all-time classic for me.
Yeah, see, and that's the thing. I think that you have like 3 or 4 tracks here which are so good that it literally carries the entire album, and the rest of it I would lump in with other like nondescript AC/DC songs. I'm going to give it a 7.5, but that's just because it's held up by these other tracks that like seemingly never get old. And if this week was any indication, they didn't get old. I enjoyed listening to some of these hits over and over and over again. But if I'm remiss to say, but some of these tracks weren't on the disc, I don't know that anyone's talking about this album today. You know what I'm saying? Like it's held together by 3 or 4 tracks, which really just boosted up into an album that sold 25 million copies here in the U.S., for example.
Yeah, agreed. I read some some great quotes about this album on their on the Wikipedia entry that I just thought had to be shared, because I think they do a better job than us at kind of verbalizing their thoughts about this album. So just a couple ones that really kind of stuck out to me. David Frick in Rolling Stone in 1980 said that Back in Black is not only the best of AC/DC's 6 American albums, but the apex of heavy metal art, the first LP since Led Zeppelin II that captures all of the blood, sweat, and arrogance of the genre, which I think is well said. Another one, this is Rolling Stone critic Christian Horde, said, the leanest and meanest record of all time, balls out arena rock that punks could love. And I think that brings up an interesting point, is that like the time that the album was released, I mean, the hair metal era of the 80s hadn't really begun yet, and that kind of like really heavy kind of punk rock late 70s era was going strong. So I feel like this album really came out at the time that it should have come out.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's had this been the height of the hair metal era, I don't know that it necessarily catches on, but at the same time, it's, Led Zeppelin has now come and gone. So Black Sabbath has already hit. So people are not just shocked by this hard rock style. It was the perfect time for this. And to be fair, the band had already kind of went mainstream and hit it with their prior release, Highway to Hell, in 1 year prior. So to their credit, they were just kind of picking up where they had left off. But the timing was right for this, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah. And I do want to read one more. I think that this really, kind of just perfectly states the good and bad of this album. And it was written by Kitty Empire of the Observer. So she said, Back in Black is a preposterous drongoid record built on casual sexism, eye-rolling double entendres, a highly questionable attitude to sexual consent, a penchant for firearms, and a crass celebration of the unthinking macho hedonism that killed the band's original singer. However, it was the obsessive soundtrack of my adolescence, the racy middle-brow thriller that spoke to me both as a tomboy who wanted to be one of the guys and the increasingly female ingenue who needed to work out the world of men. Plus, teenagers love death.
I'm going to just end our commentary right there and leave that on its own, because that is extremely well said. I do want to go back to last week for 1 second with our Tesla album. We actually had another recommendation, and I think it's something that we can cover later on. But they said that if you enjoyed Tesla, to listen to that Badlands debut. They were another band that came out in '89, and I think it's something that's worth listening to. And it's interesting because Paul O'Neill of Savatage kind of produced that album, which is, again, very much in the same vein. I know a couple of songs off the album. I don't know the full album, but really cool stuff, and got a lot of positive feedback from our Tesla episode. So Dale, thanks again for recommending it, and thanks everyone for listening. But let's get to the news of the week, because there's a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning, and I very, very excited about 2 things in particular. I had mentioned the Porcupine Tree, and you obviously mentioned it as well, the Porcupine Tree album that was coming out. But there were 2 other bands that announced singles that were going to be released in the not-so-distant future, with full albums to be coming out on next year. And that's Amorphous and Blind Guardian. Amorphous announced their new album, Halo, which is due out on February the 11th of next year. Singles forthcoming. And Blind Guardian announcing their new single, Deliver Us from Evil, which will be out on December 3rd. Needless to say, 2 of the more consistent bands, both of which we've discussed on the show, and you can hear those episodes in the archives, I am looking forward to both of these singles because Amorphous, especially, is just the epitome of consistency, and I just obviously I love that sound.
Yeah, and not just consistency, but uniqueness. I mean, I find that no other band really sounds like Amorphous. So, and Blind Guardian goes without saying. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to both of those. I just wanted to mention quickly also, because I know two of our regular listeners, Nops and Mike, are fans of the band Stabbing Westward. They actually are going to be releasing their first album in 20 years. And that album's gonna be called Chasing Ghosts, and that'll be out in March of next year. So I don't know if you've ever really given Stabbing Westward a good listen. It's kind of in the vein of that like late '90s kind of Nine Inch Nails style industrial rock / metal. But I always found that they had really catchy stuff. So it's kind of cool to hear that they're doing another album 20 years later.
Yeah, I know nothing by them. I think there's one or two songs that I've heard, and I think they had one or two really big hits that I kind of vaguely remember.
You probably would know "What Do I Have to Do."
That's it.
It's probably their most popular song.
Yeah, and they to your point, very much that industrial sound, which I can kind of take or leave. But I'm curious to hear new music from any band that gets back together after 20 years, considering they're pretty popular. They have quite a name for themselves, and they kind of maintain their popularity over time. So kudos to them for getting back together. So that kind of wraps up the news for the week, unless you have anything else.
No, that's pretty much it.
So
had a lot to say last week, not as much this week. I did see that that Ozzy's Diary of a Madman album is going to be celebrating 40th anniversary. So I'm sure at some point we'll have to talk about one of Ozzy's iconic solo albums. I almost chose this actually, but
get out of here.
I'm at this point now where I have like a ton of albums that I want to talk about, and so I'm having a hard time figuring out which ones to pick.
Well, lots of time left, but unfortunately, we're going to have to choose one for next week. What are you going with? I think Ozzy would have been an interesting choice, but I feel like you have something else in store for next week.
Yeah, I do. There's a band that I think the both of us got into late because they've been around a while, and when we got into them, we really got into them, and that band's Pretty Maids, and we haven't really had a chance to talk about any of their albums. And in all honesty, like, I don't really know any of their albums start to finish from before I got into them, which was around the time Pandemonium was released. So I'm going to go with Future World just because some of my favorite songs are on this album. Yellow Rain, Rodeo, Love Games, the title track. So that's the choice I made. I was having a hard time choosing something, and then I read an article about Ronnie Atkins, and he's still kind of struggling with his stage 4 lung cancer. So I thought, I don't know, that just kind of made me feel like we should talk about Pretty Maids, and I'm trying my best to choose bands we haven't talked about in long form yet. It's getting a little bit harder, but there's a handful that I've found. So I think we got still plenty more bands we haven't spoken to yet, and we'll definitely be revisiting bands we have spoken about. But I just thought this was a good choice. I don't know that I've ever actually listened to this album start to finish, although I do know all the songs from it. So, I look forward to talking about Pretty Maids. I know that they played this album in its entirety on one of their last pre-pandemic tours. I know they played it in its entirety on 70,000 Tons of Metal, the Metal Cruise. So, obviously, it's held in high regards by the band. It's their second full length album. It came out in 1987. So Let's talk about Pretty Maids.
I love the choice. I knew it was only a matter of time, and I can assure that everyone that's listening, I have plenty of albums and bands that we have not discussed. So I keep a running list, and I have all the requests that come in on a rolling basis. So I always look back at those as well. But plenty of new stuff and plenty of albums by bands that we have discussed, because some of these bands have such massive discographies that I think it's worth talking about some of them in long form more than once. But I look forward to Pretty Maids next week. Great choice with the album. I got into them around the same time you did in the 2000s. So it's good to go back, because even though I think we know a lot of the hits off this stuff, I definitely don't know some of the deeper cuts. So good choice. I like it a lot. Thanks everyone for listening. Keep reaching out to us if there's anything that you want us to cover. We have our album picked out for next month and the start of next month. But other than that, we have a list of requests, and we kind of go through them as timely as they may be. So keep them coming. We love the engagement, and we will talk to everyone soon when we come back and go back to 1987 with Pretty Maids' Future World.
Beautiful.
Talk to you soon, bud. I'll talk to you later.
All righty. Take care.